The death of John the Baptist was one of the most important parts of Jesus' life. The death of John the Baptist highlights why Jesus came into this world. Jesus came into a world ruled by sin. Jesus came into a world ruled by people who were ruled by the sinful, selfish desires of their heart. And among them was Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was the son of King Herod the Great. Herod the Great did great things, but he also did a lot of evil things. But he was friendly with the Romans. So when he died, the Emperor Caesar Augustus granted him his will to divide his kingdom into 3 parts among his 3 sons, Philip, Herod Archelaus, and Herod Antipas. Now Herod Antipas was not a king. He was what was known as a tetrarch. He was a ruler, but he was not a ruler of that much. He was the ruler of Galilee and Perea, and he was the one who put John the Baptist in prison, and he was the one who put John the Baptist in prison and eventually had him beheaded. And the reason and the story of how and why he came to do this is really interesting and rather scary. So, according to the Jewish historian Josephus, crowds of people were coming to John the Baptist because they were greatly moved by his words. And according to Josephus, Herod Antipas saw John the Baptist as a threat. Because according to Josephus, it seemed as though, because people responded so strongly to what John the Baptist was saying, it seemed as though people were willing to do anything John said. And as a result, according to Josephus, Herod Antipas believed that John the Baptist had the potential to raise rebellion against Herod. So Herod Antipas saw John the Baptist as a dangerous man and thought John the Baptist was better off dead. This is how Herod Antipas felt according to Josephus. But Josephus, the Jewish historian Josephus, clearly did not know some very important facts. There's a wonderful pastor named Mike Winger, and I believe his direct quote was, Josephus tells us what outsiders know, and the Gospels tell us what insiders know. And the Gospel tells us what insiders know. And the Gospel tells us what insiders know. See, Mark's Gospel tells us that Herod Antipas really enjoyed listening to John the Baptist. Direct translations from the Greek say that Herod Antipas listened to John the Baptist very gladly. Mark's Gospel says that Herod Antipas was very protective of John. The Amplified Bible tells us that Herod continually protected John. Direct translations from the Greek use words like preserve and treasure, implying that Herod Antipas really took care of John the Baptist. He did his very best to protect John the Baptist, implying that Herod's feelings towards John the Baptist ranged from enjoying him to treasuring him, treasuring what he was doing, treasuring what he was saying, treasuring what he was doing, treasuring what he was saying. What a big difference between what the Jewish historian Josephus says and what Mark's Gospel tells us. Herod Antipas listened to John the Baptist very gladly and would continually protect him. He enjoyed listening to John. But there was one thing that John the Baptist said that Herod definitely did not enjoy listening to. John would say to Herod, "It is unlawful for you to marry your brother's wife." Herod Antipas had married Herodias, who was initially the wife of his brother Philip. And John the Baptist made it very clear that this was unlawful. essentially saying that God was against this. So according to Wikipedia, Herod was on a trip to Rome. He stayed with his brother Philip, and there he fell in love with his brother's wife, and they both agreed to marry each other. And John the Baptist is saying that Herod's decision to marry his brother's wife and Herodias' decision to marry her husband's brother was a reflection of them following the sinful desires of their heart. John the Baptist is spending his life spreading a message that reflects the words of the prophet Isaiah. And I believe John is pouring his love for God out of his heart so that God can use what is pouring out of his heart to work through people's minds and hearts. Josephus tells us that John the Baptist was encouraging people to be righteous towards one another and pious towards God. John the Baptist is pouring this message out of his heart so that God can use what is pouring out of his heart to wash over everyone who is coming into the Jordan River so that they can sink into what God is speaking through John the Baptist. A message from God. John is pouring out a message from God. John is pouring out what he hears from God. John is pouring out God's word so that people can sink their lives into God's word and be changed and transformed. And as more people become changed into God's image, the message pouring out of John's heart, can be used by God to contribute to building an environment where people follow the desires of God's heart. I believe this is all John wants. He wants to be used by God so that his life plays a part in being used to contributing to an environment where people follow the desires of God's heart. But this environment is ruled by Herod Antipas, and someone in a position of leadership is in a position of influence. And when someone in a position of influence is following the sinful desires of their heart, their decisions are going to influence others. So this isn't John just getting stirred up about Herod Antipas breaking a rule about divorce. There's a deeper problem that John the Baptist is speaking to. John is living his life to be used by God to contribute to building an environment where people follow the desires of God's heart. And yet in this environment there is someone in a position of influence who is following the sinful desires of their heart. And that decision is going to influence others, and it can destroy people's lives. And this sinful decision can influence others and destroy lives. Where people make bad decisions following their flesh, bad decisions sexually, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The decision to follow the sinful desires of your heart. This can destroy your life and the lives of others, especially when you're in a position of influence. And this is what John is speaking to. Mark's gospel tells us that Herod enjoyed listening to John, but he was very perplexed. He was confounded. Other translations say he was puzzled. He was greatly puzzled, confounded. And I wonder if Herod was captivated by the beauty of John speaking about the beauty of God's love. And yet he was confronted, perplexed, confounded by John's words, speaking not only of God's love and God's embrace, but also words about God's sternness, that people turn away from sin. I wonder if that's what puzzled Herod. Words that embraced, the words coming from God that embraced you, but then there are words from God that embrace you, and then there are words from God that push you away from things that are not of God, things that are sinful and destructive. I wonder if that's what perplexed and confounded Herod. I imagine John the Baptist spoke words coming from God that really touched Herod's heart. But when John the Baptist said things like, Herod must have been confounded when he felt the Spirit in God's words, and the same Spirit that was embracing him was also pushing him away from his sins, particularly his sin to marry his brother's wife, Herodias. Here's a little something about Herodias. So Herod Antipas's father. So Herod Antipas's father is King Herod the Great. Herodias is initially married to Philip, who was also a son of King Herod the Great. Herod the Great had many sons with different wives. So Herodias was the wife of King Herod the Great's son Philip, and then she became the wife of Herod Antipas, who was also a son of King Herod the Great. These two were half-brothers. But here's the crazy thing. Herodias, she was not only a wife of two children of Herod the Great, Herodias was also the daughter of King Herod the Great. So these are incestuous relationships, incestuous marriages. The sinful. Is this a thing about trying to keep wealth in the family? Whatever it is, I don't think I'm being too much when I say that this is a family where the sinful nature really sat in the driver's seat in this family. This was a family where people were led first by their sinful nature. And it makes it all the more interesting that Herod Antipas had positive feelings towards John the Baptist, that he was responding positively to John the Baptist, and yet he struggled when John the Baptist would say to him. Now Herodias simply did not like this. I wrote this little scene to describe Herodias' feelings about John the Baptist about John the Baptist publicly declaring that her marriage was sinful. I don't think anyone likes hearing that their marriage is a reflection of the sinful desires of their heart. And I wrote this little scene to sort of explain it, to sort of just depict it. That desert rat. So she wanted John the Baptist dead. She had a grudge against him. I imagine she felt that John the Baptist had defiled her name. She felt John the Baptist had defiled her life choices, which she believed were none of his business. And yet John the Baptist feels that her personal decisions are not personal to her. Her sinful decisions are going to affect other people's lives and destroy other people's lives and potentially destroy other people's lives. But she wouldn't really understand any of that. Someone in her position would only see things the way she saw things, would have no interest in seeing things the way John the Baptist saw things. So she wants John the Baptist dead. But the problem is, she knows that her husband Herod Antipas likes John the Baptist, and he would continually protect John the Baptist from harm. So Herod Antipas puts John the Baptist in prison because John was publicly objecting to Herod's marriage. And I imagine Herod Antipas put John in prison as a disciplinary action to let John know that he's in no place to publicly object his marriage. And because Herod had such positive feelings towards John, he intended nothing further than some kind of disciplinary action. Because he enjoyed, because he was fond of John. He enjoyed listening to him. He was protective of John. One of the best, I think, I've seen a lot of different versions of this story, and I think the best one is in Jesus of Nazareth, where you have Christopher Plummer as Herod Antipas and Michael York as John the Baptist, and it's so great. Christopher Plummer, most famous for The Sound of Music, but I think now he'll be just as famous for his part in Knives Out. If you haven't seen Knives Out, definitely watch Knives Out and just see how incredible Christopher Plummer is. Christopher Plummer's in his 90s in that movie, and he's so incredible. And if you haven't seen The Sound of Music, come on, what are you doing with your life? So Christopher Plummer, he does a great job of playing someone who is everything Herod Antipas would be. A man in a position of power, a man who would live with his sinful desires at the front seat. Why wouldn't he? He's got all the, he's got every, he's in a position of wealth. He can have whatever pleases him. So he lives with the sinful, he lives a life led by his sinful pleasures. And Christopher Plummer does a great job of playing that kind of person while also being someone who would respond strongly to the words of John the Baptist. He does such a great job of being that kind of person who is led by their sinful pleasures and yet also having these tender feelings towards John the Baptist. It's a beautiful performance. And Jesus of Nazareth is 6 hours. It's a mini series. But just go on YouTube and look at the scenes with Christopher Plummer as Herod Antipas. He's so great. And Michael York is equally great as John the Baptist. It's probably my favorite Michael York performance. But yeah, I think his performance as John the Baptist, I think it's my favorite performance of anyone playing John the Baptist thus far. So check it out. If you're not willing to watch the miniseries, check it out. Check out the scenes on YouTube. And I'm sad to say I can't recall who plays Herodias, but she's incredible. And in that version is a great depiction of the story in Mark's Gospel, where Herodias wants John dead, but Herod Antipas practically loves John. He's protective of him. Direct translations from the Greek say he treasured John, imply that he treasured John the Baptist. So she's got to use her wit. If she wants John dead, she has to use her wit. She has to outwit Herod Antipas somehow.